I'm Jim Ogsbury, the Executive Director of the Western Governors Association. It is my distinct honor to help launch the WGA Chair of Idaho Governor Brad Little. What distinguishes WGA Chair initiatives is that they drive to action. Yes, they involve intense examination of regional issues, and yes, we assemble experts from government and industry and academia and non-government organizations to offer their best wisdom and suggestions. And they do lead to the identification and syntheses of best practices. And of course, they stimulate creative discussions and generate new ideas. But even more important, they also produce significant, impactful deliverables, new land management tools, gubernatorial policy, specific statutory and regulatory recommendations. And so it is with Working Lands, Working Communities, Chair Little's initiative. Although it's hard to predict what those deliverables will be, I'm confident that the initiative will help position Western governors to be especially influential with respect to the next federal farm bill and to work in partnership with federal agencies to increase the productivity and prosperity of Western lands and communities. I am excited about today's launch and honored to introduce WGA's chair, the 33rd governor of the great state of Idaho, the Honorable Brad Little.
Thank you, Jim. I'm pleased to kick off WGA's, as the chair, our initiative, Working Lands, Working Communities. There are so many challenges that face the West. And of course, today on our collective minds is the threat of wildfire, which has ravaged so many of our communities, is taking a greater toll on Western states with every passing year. These devastating impacts are further compounded by the extended drought most of us in the West are experiencing. I cannot overstate the important role Working Lands, which includes our farmers, ranchers, loggers, local fire volunteers, have in contributing to the economic viability and cultural values of Western communities. But we face a growing need for additional capacity, both intellectual capacity and physical infrastructure, to responsibly manage abundant natural resources that we are so blessed with here in the West. The Working Lands, Working Communities initiative will expand interdependent relationships between Western communities and our federal partners, state partners, local and tribal governments that manage land and resources. It will look at the critical role that these local communities play in successful land planning and management processes. Over the next several months, WGA will convene federal, state, local policymakers and stakeholders to discuss these and other issues. The goal is to develop bipartisan strategies to support Western communities seeking to improve cross-boundary management of lands, mitigate wildfire risk, and restore ecosystems. There are 5 main areas the initiative will dive into. The first is to examine community relationships with natural resources and working lands, and the important role that rural communities play in the management of these resources. The second is to identify barriers to cross-boundary collaboration and execution. Many areas do not have the infrastructure to address landscape challenges, to mitigate the threat to wildlife, and to restore land affected by fire. The initiative will identify best practices to help communities overcome these barriers. The third is to assess local capacity, expertise, and resources to address rural ecological challenges. It will examine how those capabilities contribute to the success of land management activities. The fourth is to explore tools and innovations for rural communities to adapt to changing economic, environmental, or technological conditions. One challenge here is the need to expand markets that support active management on Western working lands. A good example is examining potential markets for the relatively low value timber and biomass that needs to be removed to reduce the threat of uncharacteristic wildfire. And finally, the fifth key is to look at statutory and regulatory changes that promote sustainable Western communities and working lands. The outcomes can help inform Congress and the administration on changes that can improve our Western land landscapes and the vitality of our Western communities. I'm pleased to be joined today by three excellent guests that work on these issues every day. Sonya Germann is the Montana State Forester and current chair of the Council of Western State Foresters. Lesli Allison is the executive director of Western Landowners Alliance, and Tom Schultz is the director of resources and government affairs for the Idaho Forest Group. So with that, Sonya, do you want to start us out?
Yes, thank you, Governor Little, for the chance to be with you today as you launch this important initiative. Doing so in the middle of one of our most significant fire years only underscores the importance of the objectives you propose to undertake. Perhaps the hardest hit by years like these are rural communities you speak of, the ones that face compounding issues from wildfire, drought, and dwindling economies, and who are surrounded by a myriad of ownerships that not only provide beneficial resources to the local community, but may also present the greatest risk. Your initiative recognizes the interdependence of landscapes, strong rural economies, and overall community well-being. We have a saying in the West that the major issues facing our forests and rangelands don't recognize ownership boundaries, and neither should our solutions. We have a lot of excellent tools that you mentioned that are in the toolbox, including shared stewardship agreements, forest action plans, good neighbor authority, and stewardship contracting, just to name a few. As we continue to lean into these tools, plans, and authorities, I believe we are starting to work better than ever across ownership boundaries. The work is hard and takes persistence, commitment, and good faith. Your initiative highlights one of the most important lessons we seem to trip over time and time again. The best and most durable solutions are those that are locally driven, ones that galvanize and support local leadership, encourage collaboration, promote local industries and workforce capacity, and provide markets for the goods we derive from achieving our collective management goals. As an example, and from a state forester perspective, we would love nothing more than to see large landscape scale management occur adjacent to communities that addresses major forest health and wildfire risk issues, protects critical infrastructure, and sees in many places the actual return of high-paying wood products jobs that would stimulate local economic growth. Governor, as Western State Foresters, we are well positioned to support you and the Western Governors Association in your efforts with this initiative, and thank you for your commitment to and leadership in resolving the most pressing issues facing our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonya. Lesli?
Thank you for this opportunity to be here today. At Western Landowners Alliance, we're very appreciative of this initiative and your leadership on this issue. It's extremely timely and relevant to our work and to the challenges and opportunities that we're experiencing in the West today. I think one of the most exciting things about the West is the very direct and visible connection between human communities and the natural landscape, as well as the close personal relationships that most of us in the West have with land and nature. At Western Landowners Alliance, our mission is to support landowners in sustaining working lands, connected landscapes, and native species. Every one of us depends on these lands and ecosystems, and every one of us, whether we live in downtown Denver or out on a remote ranch, also has an impact on these resources. Stewardship, whether of nature or community or family, implies something more than either preservation or even wise use. It implies a caring, mutually beneficial relationship. It's about recognizing that in a living system, the well-being of the whole is dependent on the well-being of the many interrelated parts. A healthy and productive landscape is essential to a healthy and prosperous community, and a strong community in turn is essential to sustaining the working lands around it. Here in the West, the quality of our relationships with the land and with one another is foundational to prosperity. The West is widely known for its public lands, but private lands are the cornerstones, both of our ecosystems and our human communities. Ecologically, private and working lands offer some of the richest biodiversity per acre in the West and supply essential habitat for most wildlife species. The elk that millions of visitors to Yellowstone National Park enjoy watching in the summers spend their winters largely on private lands outside the park. At the same time, many of the ranches that support these wildlife populations depend on being able to graze on public lands to survive economically and provide local food. Without that opportunity, much of the winter range for wildlife would already be subdivided and developed. Private forests and rangelands play a huge role in sequestering carbon and supplying water. People in Albuquerque and Santa Fe, for example, may not realize it, but their municipal water supply depends heavily on how private landowners in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado manage their forests. And in turn, these landowners' ability to manage their forests well depends heavily on how the surrounding U.S. Forest Service manages its lands. Private lands are also economic engines, supporting everything from agriculture and recreational economies to energy production. Landowners have a deeply vested and personal and financial stake in the landscape and in their communities. They also have deep, locally relevant knowledge and experience. So when it comes to conserving and restoring land and natural resources, it's essential that landowners are at the table as core partners from the outset. And there are many great examples from across the West of successful public-private partnerships and locally led collaborative conservation from which we can learn. We can build on these models, but scaling up will require political will and investment. And I'm grateful that the Western Governors Association is taking the lead and look forward to working with Governor Little and other partners in this important work. Thank you.
Thank you. Tom?
Governor, again, thank you for this opportunity to participate today. I want to talk about three things. I want to talk about Idaho's forest in terms of the economic impacts. I want to talk about some of the threats to the forest, and I also want to talk about some of the opportunities. So first of all, Idaho's forest, 80%, as we know, are owned by the federal government. Only 14% of Idaho's forests are private. So that requires a significant work to be done to address some of the issues we're facing. We have about 31,000 jobs that are in the forest products sector in Idaho. It contributes about $2.4 billion annually to the economy. We, in 2020, harvested 1.1 billion board feet. We produced about 1.8 billion board feet of lumber. For every 1 million board foot harvested, we support 25 jobs, direct and indirect, in the state of Idaho. So the economic impact of this industry is significant for our state, as is agriculture and other components of the state economy, but it is a key component. And able to be working on these lands, they support the communities. We have a saying, healthy forests equate to healthy communities. Some of the threats we're facing, you mentioned in your opening remarks, forest health and fire. Two of the biggest issues we see, the state of Idaho has identified over 6 million acres at threat from insect and disease and wildfire. Nationally, there's over 80 million acres that are identified. So through shared stewardship and good neighbor authority, we've got the opportunity to address some of these risks. Governor, you yourself have signed a shared stewardship agreement, pledging to double the acres treated in Idaho on federal lands by 2025. That's the kind of leadership that we need, and we support that and appreciate your efforts to do that. This year alone, we've burned over 300,000 acres in the state, so we know the threat is out there, and active management is one of the key tools that we have to address and mitigate those threats. Finally, on some of the opportunities that we have, there's an infrastructure bill in Congress right now that has over $5 billion targeted at forestry infrastructure. There's money in there for good neighbor authority, firefighting, CFLR projects, and we see that being a significant opportunity to address some of the barriers we have. In many cases, it's funding. And I would recommend that if that funding does become available, that many of those dollars do come directly to the states. We could really beef up the Good Neighbor Authority program. Right now, there's over $200 million allocated for that program. And also, there's a lot of authorities that the federal government has now to expedite management through use of categorical exclusions and others to expedite that management. And we would recommend that the Forest Service be able to use those authorities to their extent when and if that money is made available. So appreciate the opportunity to be today.
Thank you, Tom. Sonya, you touched on it, and both Tom and I talked about shared stewardship. What do you think with the Forest Service? What do you think's working and what's not working? Tom just alluded to scaling it up. From your view, what do you think we ought to do next?
Thanks, Governor, for that vexing question. Yeah, so shared stewardship, of course, reigns prominent with the state foresters across the West, and I would say that we also have the opportunity to play a pretty significant leadership role within our respective states. I would say what's working well is the will is there. Things like the shared stewardship agreements, especially our forest action plans. For instance, in Montana, we're using a forest action plan to really galvanize that work together across ownership boundaries. The will is there, the getting it done is very, very difficult. It can be delays perhaps with NEPA, it can be shortages in resources, just the number of acres that we need to treat. For example, in the state of Montana, you just heard from Idaho, state of Montana, we have over 9 million acres that are facing significant wildfire risk and forest health issues. And we're treating approximately 100,000 acres per year between all agencies. We simply do not have the resources to meet the scale of the need. And then the various processes and all of these authorities that are actual very helpful tools, but there are still barriers in actually knitting those things together and making those work on a large landscape scale basis. So I think it's going to take resources, policy push. I'm really excited about the things in your initiative to really look at, get down and dirty into those barriers and look for some solutions, because that's what's going to keep us from getting the work. But I think the will is there, and I think the timing is right. Thanks, Governor.
Well, thank you, Sonya. And Leslie, from your view, representing the private landowners, what do you think the most critical need is to advance the ball on the things that you talked about?
Well, I think locally led collaboration is an essential piece of it, for certain. And I think there are challenges with that. We have siloed systems of federal lands management, for example, that don't always communicate well together, are sometimes challenged to communicate well with local entities on the ground, or to stick with a collaborative process. There's just questions about decision making and authorities that still need to be ironed out, although I feel like there's good progress being made on those things. But I think that the challenge is somewhat the scale. I would concur with that. And the markets are a challenge, how we're going to pay for a lot of the stewardship that is happening. You know, one of the challenges landowners face for example, in managing forests is that, you know, we lack infrastructure in many cases. We lack mills, we lack trucks to haul to market. And in some cases, we lack labor. I was just visiting a ranch in southern Colorado that actually built its own mill, but they're very challenged by finding labor to support the mill. And part of the issue, of course, is federal lands has so much of the timber that we're dependent on a steady supply and ability of federal lands to commit, you know, that to keep the infrastructure in place, to keep this whole thing working. So I think those are the types of challenges that we really deal with out there. And another one that is of concern to us is just simply we need to be working more cooperatively together. There's been too much, you know, war between working lands and the environment. We all have so much in common. And I think finding the political will to come together on common ground and find those solutions and deepen mutual understanding and trust is imperative if we're going to succeed.
Well, thank you. I couldn't agree more. Tom, you've seen this from your experience in Montana, your experience with the Department of Lands of Idaho, and of course now with Idaho Forest Group, which I might put in a plug for the Western Governors. It was Idaho Forest Group and the current Secretary, Vilsack, and my predecessor, Governor Otter, that started GNA years ago. What do you think the next things are we need to do to scale it up?
So, you know, Governor, what I would say is focus. There are so many new ideas out there of things that could or should be done, and I think it's distracting. You think about when we have a wildfire, the idea is to focus on initial attack, suppression, you know, and people are clear what their objectives are. On the forest management side, if we took a wildfire perspective and said, we do have a forest health crisis right now, and we acknowledge across the West, and that is fueling the fires, right, in terms of what's happening. If we had focus on that and treated and acknowledged the need to treat the forest like we fight wildfire, and if we took up an approach like that and really focused on that scale and looked at the kind of agreements we need to put in place to get that work done, whether it's we have the authority now to do 20-year stewardship contracts. Imagine if we did more of those across the landscape. We had people responsible for large landscapes. It could be hundreds of thousands of acres, and they're going to be managing that over time. They've got equipment out there. I mean, so those are some of the things in my mind is focus on getting that work done, as well as on the contractors, right? We know we cannot do this work without, you mentioned loggers and haulers and those folks that are out there. I mean, knowing that they're under pressure too. Their insurance rates are going up, their equipment's getting more expensive, technology is increasing. So focused on the work at hand. And I think looking at the right scale and bringing those resources to bear, and we never lose an opportunity to focus on what we're trying to get done. We've got to manage these forests. We obviously have a social license to do that. We have to respect that. But that if we don't manage these forests, fire is going to manage them for us, and we don't want that.
One of my analysis of what's going on is a handful of Western governors were on a call with the president a month ago, I think, and it was interesting. We in the Intermountain West, Montana, Utah, Idaho, Colorado, but it's interesting. Literally, all the Western states have this concern, and the governors, all the governors on the call, expressed to the president the need to be more proactive in what we need to do to be prepared. And I really think we have an opportunity, the people on this call, the people viewing, to do what all three of you talked about, is scale this up. There's zero advocates for these big catastrophic fires. There's some advocates for smaller fires, but these smaller fires, if they start in the Intermountain West in July, then we have catastrophic fires. We're getting the days are getting a little shorter and we're a little better off. But I really think, WGA and the people that are on this, now's the time to really find the low-hanging fruit to scale things up and get a concrete plan. We need to send signals to the market that this is going to be a long-term, that a current mill needs to expand. In some of these areas where they have no mills, it's critical that, or particularly if they've got one that's not doing very well, that we make sure that that mill has a guaranteed supply, as guaranteed as we can make it, so that they can make those capital decisions to have that capacity. And I'm hopeful that that's a big part of, what these recommendations are. Jim said something about knowing what the end results are. I don't know what the end results are. I know what I want some of them to be, but we want to use this opportunity in this year as a chance for all the partners all over the West to get together and say, what are we doing right? What maybe are we doing wrong? And what can we do to advance the ball? And I'm very hopeful that that's the net sum of this. I'm looking forward to this initiative, working with all the governors in the West in a bipartisan manner for literally plain old common sense solutions. I often joke that if you landed on Earth from a foreign world and you looked at the forest health, you say, boy, they ought to do something about that. I think most people agree. And so we're looking forward to our first workshop that'll be hosted by Governor Spencer Cox next month in October. Our Vice Chairman, Jared Polis, will host the second workshop, and we will plan other workshops. But to any of you viewing, if you have any good ideas, either get a hold of the governors or better yet, WGA, and let's put all those together on a virtual whiteboard and say, what can we do to move the needle? I want to thank all three of you for, what you offered. It kind of makes me feel good that we're literally, a lot of these resource issues, there's parties that are miles apart. All the parties, whether it's the most vehement conservationists or the most vehement commodity productionists, the distance between those is very little, and we just need to focus on and get across the finish line. And I believe we will. It's a little sad that we had to have a fire year and a drought like this to kind of galvanize everybody together. But the saying that I don't like very well, never let a crisis go to waste, comes to mind. But there is a crisis. But the thing is, we know what the solution is. We know that we start around these communities and build out from there, go to areas where there's still an infrastructure there. Some of the other areas that we'll put a little further on the back shelf. And I know it's different in other states. So I just want to thank all of you for watching, but I hope you get involved in this effort. Reach out to us, and WGA will keep everyone informed about when the shops are in your area, and we literally will move the needle, which I think is important, so that these communities, these working lands and working communities will be successful into the future. So thank you all very much for participating.
Thank you,
Thank
Jeff.
you.